Hi, I'm DJ Ware. On this episode of the Cyber Gizmo, I'm going to be talking about the bunch. That's Burroughs, UNIVAC, NCR, Control Data, and Honeywell again. This is part 2 in this series, right after this. So this time we're going to be talking about Control Data Corporation. So I'm kind of working backwards. I did Honeywell, then CDC. And yeah, we'll keep going down the list as we go through this, if you guys are still interested in this. So let's start with the early 1950s. So there was a company called Remington-Rand, and they wanted into the computer business because there was companies making money in it, and they wanted part of that too. So rather than go and spend the time to find engineers and build up their own business and learn all about how to build and make computers, they decided to buy 2 companies to do that. And the first one they bought was Eckert Mauchly's Computer Corp, EMCC, and they bought them in 1950. They also purchased the Minnesota-based Engineering Research Associates, or ERA, in 1952. Now, ERA has kind of an interesting history. At the end of World War II, the U.S. Navy had a number of engineers that were on contract in order to be able to do deciphering and decryption of messages that were being transmitted by the German Enigma and also by the Japanese Navy and Japanese armed forces. So these guys, the Navy didn't want to let go, but they had a mandate from the Department of Defense that said, hey, you got to let these guys go. You can't keep them on. But the Navy, of course, being the Navy, they figured out a different way to try to hang on to them. So they approached a Minnesota company called Chase Airlines, or Chase Aircraft Company, and they went to the CEO at the time, and they asked him to take on these engineers, and the Navy would work out something in order to be able to help him defray the cost of their salaries. And that went on for a number of years where the Navy did that, but eventually Congress caught wind of it, and it was kind of a mild flap that, it was the Navy owns a corporation. What in the world is going on here? So the Navy had to get out of it. And so the aircraft company really didn't want to keep them on, so he kind of spun them off on their own, and they formed ERA and continued to operate that way. Well, as soon as Remington-Rand came along, they got caught up and bought out by them. And the fish in the sea all kind of started combining. You had UNIVAC and Rand, and then Sperry and UNIVAC joined, and so by 57 you had Sperry UNIVAC. Their company was working on the successor to the 1101, I think it was. They had the 1102, and they were working on the 1103. There were 4 engineers that came out of ERA. There was William Norris, Willis Drake, Seymour Cray, and then the former treasurer, Arnold Ryden. They weren't really interested in wanting to do what Sperry UNIVAC was doing, because Sperry was working on conventional computers, and that had all been done. They weren't interested in that. So these guys were a lot brighter. They wanted to go and do something new, and Sperry wasn't interested. They tried to convince him to go off on a different, and Sperry said, no, you're going to do this. And they said, no, we're not. And they left to form a Control Data Corporation. Control Data Corporation just had one goal, and that is they wanted to build the world's fastest computers. That is, the fastest computers that were ever built. Their first computer was the CDC 1604, and they built that in 1959. It was not a quote-unquote supercomputer, but it certainly was groundbreaking in its own right. The University of Illinois, Searle, which operated Plato, that's program logic for automated teaching operations, basically a computer dedicated to computer-aided instruction. They installed one of those computers in 1963. Plato, up until that time, had been operating on the ETA system that was currently installed on campus in Champaign-Urbana. The university was off working on ETA 4. So they didn't have a need for the older machine, and so Plato kind of moved in and took it over. But they were rapidly outgrowing it. They had needs for a much faster machine, and this one seemed to fill the bill. And in fact, it did fill the bill all the way up till about mid-70s when, they needed more horsepower in order to be able to continue to drive forward. So that machine formed the basis of Plato 3, and then in 75 they bought another cyber machine from CDC that was Plato 5. But that's a story for a different day, even though I told you most of it already. Follow on to the 1604 was the CDC 6600. This was the first supercomputer ever built by anyone, and it was designed by Seymour Cray and James E. Thornton in 1964. You can see from the picture here, it had a number of unique features. The first is it had a console, which used 2 round displays. Those came from those. Everything is always used from somewhere, and those came from radar screens that were scaled down, is my understanding, where those came from, and so they had the technology already to do that. And most of the time, most of the displays on the machines of this era would have been teletype type devices where you had printers and paper and a keyboard attached to it. But this one didn't. It had a display. It actually had 2. The other thing that's of note is the cabinet to the right that has all the dials and the plumbing. So that is the chiller. These machines had to be, from overclocking your machines how hot they get. These machines were really overclocked. They were overclocked to the point where if they didn't cool it, that lead solder that they were using to hold the boards together would melt, and that would be a disaster, because all that solder would then run down onto other circuit boards that were below it, and the machine would self-destruct. They, I think, at this time used liquid nitrogen to cool with, and then they used a water chiller to remove the heat from the liquid nitrogen, cool it down again, and then send it back through recirculate it back through the machine. You can also see the second thing is the amount of backplane wiring that these machines required. Now, these machines had doors on them, so where the backplane is, that's actually a door that swings out, and on the inside is actually the circuitry. And then you can kind of see in the corner, you can see the brass tubing with the silver tubes fitted to it. That's the liquid nitrogen that's going through the machine in order to keep it cool. So yeah, those were all that wiring was hand wired, and it was labor intensive and took quite a bit of time and quite a large number of people to do it. Most of them were women that did that. There were guys that did it too, but there were mostly women that did that. The CDC 6600 had a number of firsts. First of all, it was the first to run calculations in, now I'm going to put this in quotes, parallel. Today we would call this multi-programming, because it was the machine was actually using, I think this used the barrel shifter. I know the 6400 used the barrel shifter. I think this one did too, but it was a mechanism by which the CPU would discover there was nothing, it wasn't doing anything, so it would then shift to the next data stream to find something to do. So there was 12 inbound data streams, and those came in from the outside using peripheral processors to deliver the data directly to memory. The computer, the central processing unit itself, didn't have to do anything other than just do computations. So it was free to do all of that, all the management, all of the overhead and auditing and all that stuff, and getting the data in, making sure that it was correct. All that was handled by the PPUs, the peripheral processing units, and there were 12 of those. So it could execute, in theory, up to 12 equations simultaneously, and that allowed it to read a top speed of 3 MIPS, or 3 million instructions per second. Those, I think that would equate to, in flops, to 1 million flops, or floating point operations per second. But I believe that's correct, based on what I remember about the 6400, which is what we used on Plato 5. The 6600 remained the world's fastest computer until the release of the successor, the CDC 7600 in 1967. So there's kind of an interesting story here at this point. I mean, IBM saw that this machine was, the 6600 was a threat, clearly a threat, and they didn't like it. And so they were going to develop their own supercomputer called Stretch. They worked on Stretch and they got it kind of working, and then they got a mandate from corporate headquarters that said, thou shalt make this OS 360 compatible. And they went, what? Because the OS 360 was a conventional von Neumann architecture, which didn't fit the design of the Stretch at all. Well, they tried, and they tried, and they tried, and they tried, and they couldn't get it to work. And so eventually the Stretch failed. But the Stretch itself could have succeeded if it hadn't been for that mandate. But in the meantime, IBM had applied their usual FUD and telling people, hey, we got this new machine that's coming out. It's going to be great. You'll really love it. And it, of course, never arrived. But meanwhile, CDC suffered because people stopped buying their equipment, waiting for IBM's shoe to hit the ground. CDC sued them, and they won a monetary award that helped defray the costs of what they had lost. But yeah, the Seymour Cray was working on the 7600, but he was kind of a guy, as I recall from the stories about him. I didn't know him, but I had heard of him. And he was kind of one of those guys that he would work on stuff up until the point where the testing began, and then he just lost interest. That wasn't for him. He didn't care about it. He wanted to go build something new. So he went off and started working on the 8600, the successor. But he wasn't having a whole lot of luck with that. There was some problems with it, and he was having some difficulties in making it work. Well, William Norris, the CEO of Control Data, had been, pretty much betting this company on each one of these machines, taking all their profit and investing them into these machines to build them in order to sell them. So he was concerned that this was taking longer than it should have. Meanwhile, some of the team that had worked on the 6600 and some other projects were working on the CDC Star. And so Norris went over and told Seymour, hey, you need to stop working on the 8600 and go work on the Star. Well, that wasn't Seymour's project. He wasn't really interested in that. That didn't interest him. So yeah, he left CDC in 1972 to go form his own company called Cray Research. And 2 years later, Cray 1 was released in 1974. Cray is still around. They're part of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. They went through a number of acquisitions. I think at one point Compaq bought them, and then finally Hewlett-Packard bought Compaq, and in that they kept Cray. The Cray was definitely the fastest computer at the time. They were faster than anything Control Data had. And so they were competing very favorably, and they went on to build this was the Cray 1, then the Cray XMP, YMP, Cray 2, which did have a number of teething problems, and then Cray 3 stalled. There was a number of problems with that. We're not going to deal with that today, but yeah, that was kind of a bad thing that happened to Cray. But meanwhile, at CDC, Norris in 1983, because they had been losing business to Cray, he didn't want to have the financial responsibility for the company. He wanted to have it stand on its own or die on its own, right? So because CDC at this point had built up both a software business and a peripheral business. They had printers and disk drives and also, I think, tape drives. And I know they had card readers, but at this point, they also had something called an OCR reader. CDC was attempting to try to get rid of the card reader and go directly to OCR. Unfortunately, that proved to be a lot more difficult than they really expected. And Burroughs was also, at the time when I was working with them, was also interested in OCR. Burroughs got theirs to work. CDC did not get theirs to work. So yeah, it wasn't good enough to make it work. But Burroughs waited a year before they attempted it, so they had learned from what CDC's mistakes were. In the meantime, ETA Systems was off working on the ETA 10. It was named ETA 10 because its goal was to get to 10 gigaflops. And they produced that machine in 1986. They didn't quite get there. It was 9.1, but it was close enough for it to be acceptable. So, as I understand, the ETA 10 was fantastic hardware. I think they had one shipment down to the University of Florida, but the software was criticized. They had two versions of the operating system. One was compatible with the Cyber 205, which was another supercomputer that was built before the spin-off had taken place. And they also had Unix System 5, a variant of it that would run on the platform. Unfortunately, neither was really ready for this hardware platform. It had some advanced features and had pipelining, and it had some other things in it that the software really needed to be worked on in order for it to be efficient. It had stability issues. I think I remember seeing a figure of it failed once every 30 hours on average, which a software failure, which is catastrophic because your job is done, it's dead. So if you can only run it for 30 hours, that wasn't going to be acceptable in some types of calculations. The other problem was it wasn't fully utilizing, the software wasn't fully utilizing the machine. In other words, there was some kind of problem that was preventing it from scheduling additional work to fill up the machine to really run it to its advantage. I don't know whether that was because of inefficiency in the operating system or whether it was data starvation or some other problem, but in any event, they started losing money. They started losing a lot of money. And ETA closed in 1989. Due to financial losses, they laid off most of its employees. CDC, they never really recovered from that. They continued multi-year financial losses. CDC finally had to spin off their hardware business out to Control Data Systems in 1992. I think that eventually just died. It just petered out and died. I don't know if anyone actually, I know pieces of it were bought out by other companies, but I think pretty much it just died. The last pieces of CDC were spun out to Ceradan in 1997, and that was their software business. Ceradan is, I think, owned by General Dynamics today. It's hard to keep track of who owns who, but they do human resource software. So they all payroll and all that stuff. So, yeah, today as a company, Control Data no longer exists. Why did we need these large high-performance computers? Why? Why did we need that? I think that the best answer really appears in J.E. Thornton's book that he wrote on the design of a computer, the Control Data 6600. He should know he was definitely the principal designer. Seymour Cray oversaw it, but the guy that did the work was J.E. So he said the motivation for the computer came at least partly from the need to solve systems of a linear and nonlinear simultaneous algebraic equations. Those are really looking at being able to calculate certain unknowns, right? So if I have a weather forecast and I'm looking at temperature data, humidity in a certain area, what can I infer on that on a period of, say, 24, 48, 72 hours, right? So the problem that you have is that the number of simultaneous equations increases as you get close to an approximation. So as you get closer to approximating reality, you really start spiraling up the number of equations you have to solve. Some of these, I remember in the weather forecasting that the original model I remember on the Cray 1 that they ran was a model of 1 degree. So that's 75 miles square. That's not going to help very much. And then they found that if they were to try to have it, that it would take, with the present technology, about 10 years to do the calculations. So, yeah, I don't know how many of you would be interested in hearing what the weather forecast was for 10 years ago, but I doubt very many people would be interested in listening to that. So, yeah, it's really a problem that these larger machines have to be able to solve. And it requires faster and faster ones the more toward a real system that you want to get to. So that is one of the problems, and it's still a problem today. We haven't reached nirvana yet, that's for sure. So what are supercomputers used for? They're used for quantum mechanics. Now, this is not quantum computing. This is physics. They are used for weather forecasting, and they do a reasonable job of that sometimes. Oil and gas exploration, although I wonder how much of that is really still done. I would think by now they would pretty much know every inch of the earth on but I could be wrong. There's probably some deep sea places where they haven't gotten to yet. But yeah, molecular modeling, physical simulations, aerodynamics, nuclear fusion, cryptoanalysis. There's also this, I mean, you also have AI, but then there's also this shunt business, which has to do with, oh, great, I've got all this data. Now, how do I present it, right? So how do I get it in a meaningful form that a human can look at it and make sense of it? And the other opposite one you have is the one that CERN has, where you have these collisions that are happening inside of the Hadron Collider, and you have all of these momentary things that get created, these elements that get created. What are they, and how long do they last, and what's the properties? So they get a photo of all this massive explosion that happens when the electron slams into the target, and now they got to decipher it. And so they've been doing this since the 6600. The CDC 6600 went into CERN years and years ago. They've been looking at how to get that data analyzed and get it into the machine so that the scientists can then play with it and look at it further to try to interpret it. So yeah, there's all kinds of problems that are still around that needs to be solved. The other thing is that all of the systems use proprietary software. Like we had Janus as an operating system that was provided by CDC for the Cyber series. There was NOS on the later ones. On the earlier ones, I think there was VTMOS and some other operating. These were all proprietary. They didn't necessarily translate from one machine to the next. And yeah, they were kind of a mess. So the proprietary systems that were used to drive these supercomputers have been replaced. They've been, for the most part, replaced by Linux. Now, is that the same Linux that you're running on your desktop? Yeah, parts of it are, but the kernel's been modified in order to take advantage of placing the workloads in more of a real-time environment, and also being able to handle thousands and thousands of nodes in order to manage the workloads going across it. So yeah, they've been heavily tweaked in order to be able to work in that style of supercomputers, but pretty much it's the same as what you've got. That's pretty much all I had today. It's kind of an interesting history to see the impact one company can have, and in particular, just if you're dissatisfied and you've got 4 other people that are dissatisfied with you, what you can accomplish and what you could do. I mean, yeah, businesses are tough, right? I mean, it's especially in a competitive world like that, where you have a very limited market. They weren't IBM, obviously. IBM, like I said the first time, they were sucking up all of the money, and all that was left were these crumbs that these companies were basically, begging to get in order to stay alive. But it's amazing the risk that company took. Every time they built a machine, they put their company on the line. If it didn't sell, they were dead. And you saw what happened when it got to where they reached a point where they had a disaster on a machine design, not the hardware, but the software. When they had a software design, how it destroyed the company and they couldn't recover. And that was pretty typical of the day. We call that a shakeout. Unfortunately, it happens, and it's sad to see when it does, especially when one had given as much as CDC has to the overall IT infrastructure. I can't think of where we would be today if we were still building 1103s from Sperry-Rand or System 360s from IBM. IBM did create the 360, I think it was the Model 95, which kind of ran neck and neck with some of the CDC machines. I say some. I don't think they ever managed to get past Cray, but I remember the banter that went. I was in Searle, which was across the street from the Digital Sciences Lab, which was the IBM turf. And so that was the instruction lab for the computer scientists over there, and then we were the weirdos that worked on Plato. But I remember the banter going back and forth about how crappy the IBM was, and the IBM guys would say how inaccurate and how unstable the CDC was. But Yeah, that was just normal. It just happened all the time. Anyway, that's all I had for today. I hope you enjoyed this. Hope to see you again soon. Please like and subscribe. Bye for now.